Lauren, if Knorr's conviction gets overturned, Chauvin's third-degree murder conviction very well could be overturned as well, because one of the elements argued today clearly applies to both cases. Chauvin, however, is going to be sentenced for the higher charge that he was convicted of, second-degree murder, so it would not have a noticeable effect. It would have a huge effect, though, on Knorr's sentence.
Mohamed Noor did not act with a depraved mind.
An attorney representing former Minneapolis police officer Mohamed Noor argued to the Minnesota Supreme Court that his third-degree murder conviction in the death of Justine Ruszczyk-Damon needs to be overturned because Noor did not act with, quote, indifference to human life.
Mr. Noor was reacting to a sudden perceived threat outside his partner's window. Mr. Noor fired a single shot intending to stop that threat and believing that he was protecting his partner. Before other first responders arrived at the scene, Mr. Noor performed CPR on Ms. Ruszczyk. He comforted Ms. Ruszczyk. He tried to save Ms. Ruszczyk's life.
Caitlin Rose Fisher argued that in a recent ruling, the state Supreme Court clarified the definition of the phrase depraved mind. Fisher also argued that the court has 50 years of precedence in ruling that third-degree murder doesn't fit if it's an act directed at a particular person. That's the element the Minnesota Court of Appeals tinkered with in February when it affirmed Knorr's conviction.
Does that mean that an officer could never be convicted of third-degree murder?
Prosecutor Gene Burdorf pointed out how far-reaching the court's decision would be if it overturns the murder 3 conviction on the basis that the crime cannot be directed at a particular person.
There is not going to be an officer-involved shooting that can be prosecuted under Minnesota's depraved mind murder statute. There isn't. They are all directed with particularity.
Knorr is serving a 12.5-year sentence for that third-degree murder conviction. If that conviction is overturned, he'll have to be resentenced for second-degree manslaughter, which most likely would be 4 years. And it could result in him being released from prison based on the time that he has already served. Lauren.
Lou, thank you.